The Wistful and the Good by G. M. Baker. Chapter 1. The Ship. Elswyth sat on the cliff top, looking out over the bright sea. There was a steady onshore breeze blowing, stinging her eyes and tossing her hair out behind her. She refused to wear the wimple that should have covered her head and neck, for young men's eyes would follow her hair as it bounced and swayed and danced. Young men's eyes were a novelty and a delight. Not so long ago, a child's smock had hung from narrow shoulders, straight downward to the ground. But now a woman's dress flowed over curves like the tide flowing over smooth stones. Young men's eyes followed the curves. Whenever she walked through the village, the young men would pause in their tasks, like seagulls hanging on the wind, eyes hungry for something beneath the surface of the wave. Nor was she shy about looking at the young men. In the autumn, when the harvest had called every able body, man, woman, child, noble, free, and slave, into the fields from dawn till dusk, she had gloried in their broad backs, the flow of the muscle beneath the skin, the salt sweat of their tanned faces, and in the quiet of the evenings, she had found herself delighting in the thought of lying beside this swan or that in the soft, new-cut grass, and of the rasp of calloused hands upon soft flesh. But she was not for them. She was a thane's daughter, and promised long since to an alderman's son. Young men's eyes had no right to follow her. Her thoughts had no right to stay on hard hands and soft grass. There could be no starlit tryst on new-mown hay for her. But the eyes of the young men were not her only delight. From where she sat, her eyes could follow the great curve of the horizon, the restless boundary between sea and sand below, the roll and swell of the tide, the curve of the seagrass bent before the wind. These too were a delight, though the same blustering wind tried to tear her embroidery frame from her fingers and whisk away her threads to catch among the bracken and gorse. For the 100th time, she glanced upward, and this time, at last, she saw it, a flash of white, far out on the band of haze between sea and sky, a sail. Her frame and her needle fell into her lap as her eyes yearned outward toward a horizon that was empty once again. This is how it is when you first see a sail. It will appear for a moment, when the ship crests a swell, and the light catches the sail just so, and then it will be gone, perhaps not to be seen again for minutes, or perhaps never again. Few eyes would have caught that first flash, or known it for what it was, but Elswyth knew, and in that moment of recognition, her breath grew still, and her heart raced, and the world grew large around her. Elswyth loved ships, every rope and spar, every plank and sail. She loved the smell of the pitch that lined the seams. Her eyes followed the curves of a ship. Her hands longed to touch, to follow the rise of the curving prow, the round fullness of the stern. She loved the way a ship cleaves to the swelling of the waves, its urgent energy under the force of wind or oar, its rise and fall as it mounted and drove from crest to trough of the ocean's swell. She loved the young men who sailed in ships, with their strange voices, their hard, strong hands, their red, sea-weathered faces, their sheepskin jackets, stiff with salt and smelling of both land and sea, and the marriage of both. She loved the tales they told of wild, rocky northlands, with their soaring peaks and deep fjords, of the sun-scarred south, where winters were green and summers brown, and men and women rested on the great verandas of stone-built palaces in the heat of the day. Everywhere they travelled, it seemed, was sharper, more vivid, more extreme than Northumbria, the soft country where she was born, with its low hills, cool summers, and damp winters. Once, as a child, she had asked why they came here at all, to which the answer was, "For trade, my darling, and to see the pretty girls." At which she had pouted and said, "But you always leave us behind." And they always would leave her behind, for her fate lay elsewhere, in the alderman's hall at Bamborough. As the wife of Drefan of Bamborough, She would rule over a great hall and host kings at her table. And yet, one glimpse of a sail, and her heart was soaring over her horizon and away. Again a flash of white. She rose, letting her embroidery frame fall to the work-basket at her feet. She shaded her eyes as she strained at the horizon. A square white dot danced into view along the line between sea and sky. She took an anxious step forward, careless of the nearness of the cliff edge. Her right foot caught her work-basket and sent it tumbling over the cliff face towards the distant sands below, threads of green and gold and blue scattering to the winds. What was it? English? Pict? Norse? It was a Norse ship she longed for, but it was also Norse ships her father feared. The ship she longed for was a gna, a broad-bellied trade ship. The ships her father dreaded were longships, ships of war. Nothing but a gna had ever come to their beach. Elswyth had never seen a longship, but the news was that a dozen Norse longships had raided the holy island of Lindisfarne 2 weeks since, murdering dozens and carrying off much treasure and many slaves. Her home in Twyford was only a day's ride south of Lindisfarne, and her father, like every coastal thegn, kept anxious watch for Norse ships, though no other made his daughter his sentinel. She longed for a gna, for not only would a gna bring wine and gemstones and silver to trade for the dull necessities produced by her father's manor, it would also bring new songs, new friends, and tales of Spain. Ah, Spain! Her heart was full of the young men who sailed to Spain, who got drunk on the wines of Spain, who lounged on verandas with the dark girls of Spain. Was this a ship that had been, that would go, to Spain? Did it carry men who had been, who would go to Spain? For a moment, all the longing of her heart was fixed on Spain. The sail grew plainer now, no longer disappearing into the haze along the horizon, and sometimes she could glimpse the line of the hull. Whether it was a longship or gna, she still could not be sure, but she was certain of its course now. By the quarter it came from and the line it sailed, it was coming from Norway, and it was heading for their beach. Anything on the horizon? Her father asked. She had heard him coming up along the cliff path while her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. She could always tell his footsteps. An old wound made him favor one leg, and she could hear it in his step, a slight scuffling as his right foot rotated mid-step. There, she said, pointing at the square white dot that for the moment danced into view along the line between sea and sky. Where? He asked, cupping his hands around his eyes as he gazed out over the sea. You won't see it yet, father, she said. The holy island of Lindisfarne itself could have floated by 1/2 mile off their beach, and her father would not have seen it. But Elswyth could see a ship long before anyone else could make it out among the glare and the shimmer of the distant light. Is it coming this way? He asked. Yes, she said. It was over there the first time I saw it. Now there. That heading will bring it to us. Is it Norse? I can't quite make out the shape of the hull yet, but coming from that quarter, who else could it be? Just one ship? I've only seen one so far. Longship or gna? I'm sure it must be Uncle Harold, she said, straining her eyes to see if the ship were broad or narrow. But the ship was too far off. He did not come last year, child, her father said. Not a child any more, Elswyth said automatically. He has come spring and autumn every year since you were a bairn. But last year, not at all, and not this spring. He never did come in high summer, but this time he should be in Spain. I can see the hull now as it crests. I do think it's his ship. It must be Uncle Harold. You're sure it's just one ship? She searched the horizon again, shading her eyes against the glare of the bright sky and the sting of the onshore wind. I see no other ships, she said. Then if it is not them, if it is a longship, I can at least meet them strength to strength, her father said. Today you have proved yourself a good sentinel, child. Not a child! I will go down and call the men from the fields. Run and find me as soon as you are sure of who it is. He bent and kissed her on the top of her head. She turned and embraced him swiftly, her soft cheek brushing against his stiff beard. She was alarmed suddenly, and she could feel a touch of panic in her father as he pulled her to him. "If it is a long ship," he said, "tell the first man you see and send him to tell me. Then go to the hall, get your mother and your sisters and the other women, and get them up the road as fast as you can, and find someone to run to Anik with the news." "I'll ride myself," she said. "No, child. I'm not a child. I can ride as fast as anyone, and it saves time if I don't have to find someone to go and then tell them the message and then tell them again because they didn't listen properly the first time. I need you to help your mother. Why take a man from your battle line when I can take the message? Even if you are not a child, the road to Anik is not safe for women riding alone. There hasn't been a brigand seen on that road in 4 years, father." "Aye, but it was a poor harvest, and these are famine months until the next harvest is in, for any man who did not take proper care. There are desperate, hungry men about. If I meet one, I will shout out that there are Viking chasing me. The fox does not steal the wolf's supper. I don't have time for this argument. No, you don't, father, so don't be stubborn." Her father raised his eyes and implored heaven with outstretched arms. "All right, you may ride. But since you are not a child, for Cuthbert's sake, put your shoes on." Elswyth might wear a woman's dress, but she still went barefoot like a child. She did not like her feet to be parted from the earth, or to have the bother of taking her shoes off every time she wanted to put her feet into the sea or the river. Her father hugged her and kissed her on the top of her head, and then set off running down the cliff path. He had a strange gait as he ran, every 10th step becoming a skip, as if he were a child, and she knew that he winced with that step.